Good evening, connoisseurs of chaos, and welcome to Sarcastic History for Sleep, where we explore humanity's most harmonious moments with all the reverence of a cat for a bubble bath. But first, if our delightfully sardonic stroll through France's most agreeable period helps you drift off, do like and subscribe. It helps other insomniacs discover our particular brand of historical cynicism. And let us know in the comments which catastrophically cordial period we should examine next. Tonight, we journey to revolutionary France, that golden age of universal agreement where absolutely everyone got along like a house on fire, literally in some cases. Picture yourself as a French peasant in 1789. You've just enjoyed another nutritious dinner of bread so hard it could double as a murder weapon, seasoned with the bitter tears of economic injustice. Your hovel boasts more holes than a Swiss cheese, though considerably less appetizing. The local lord has just invented a new tax on existing without permission, and your children are learning arithmetic by counting how many relatives died of starvation this week. But rejoice, change is coming. Soon, you'll all be united in perfect fraternity. Nothing says brotherhood, quite like arguing over who gets to use the guillotine next. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the delightful decapitations and democratic dismemberment, we must first understand the paradise that was pre-revolutionary France. So, settle in, dear listeners, as we explore how perfectly content everyone was before they decided to fix everything with extreme prejudice. Chapter 1. The Ancien Régime, a symphony of serene satisfaction. France before 1789. Picture, if you will, a land of such exquisite social harmony that it makes a Swiss clock look positively anarchic. A realm where everyone knew their place with the same certainty that water knows to flow downhill, unless, of course, you happen to be paying for the aqueduct. Let us paint this masterpiece of mutual contentment. At the tippy-top of our delightful pyramid sat the king, Louis XVI, a man whose chief accomplishments included being extraordinarily good at locksmithing and catastrophically bad at everything else. Divine right, they called it, though one suspects the divinity in question was having a particularly off day when it came to distributing political acumen. Below his august majesty stretched the first estate, the clergy. What selfless shepherds of souls! They owned merely 10% of all French land, while comprising a whopping 1% of the population. But fear not. They used this modest holding purely for spiritual purposes. The fact that spiritual purposes apparently required vast hunting estates and palatial residences was merely coincidental. Then came the second estate, the nobility, such paragons of public service. Their primary contribution to society involved standing about at Versailles, perfecting the art of the devastating put-down, and discovering new and innovative ways to powder their wigs. They paid no taxes, naturally. After all, looking that fabulous was contribution enough. Which brings us to the third estate, everyone else. The bourgeoisie, the artisans, the peasants, that trifling 98% of the population who had the distinct honor of paying for absolutely everything while owning practically nothing. An arrangement of such crystalline fairness that one wonders why anyone ever complained. Diary entry, March the 15th. The Comtesse de Très Fatigué wrote, adjusting her beauty spot in the gilt mirror, Another tedious Thursday at court. The king spent the entire afternoon dismantling a clock. Her Majesty lost frightfully at cards again, only 40,000 livres this time. The dear thing is learning restraint. Lord Pompeux made the most cutting remark about my new gown. I shall have to destroy him socially. She paused, quill hovering. Cook mentioned something tiresome about the price of bread in Paris, she noted. 20 sous for a loaf, apparently. I told her to let them eat brioche, so much more sophisticated, though I'm told the lower orders lack the palate for it. How they survive on their dreary diet is beyond comprehension, she concluded. One can only pity them. Meanwhile, in a cramped bakery near the Pont Neuf, Jean-Luc kneads dough with hands cracked from endless labor. The flour cost him more than he'll make in profit. Again. Another glorious day in the kingdom, he muttered, wiping sweat with a sleeve already grimy from the pre-dawn start. My eldest has that cough again. Doctor wants 3 livres, he added. Might as well ask for the moon on a silver platter. The tax collector visited yesterday, a delightful gentleman who explained, with great patience, how Jean-Luc's contribution would help maintain the glory of France. The tale, the gabble, the corvée, a symphony of civic duty. Never mind that the Duke up the hill hadn't paid a sou since the Sun King was in short trousers. But we're all in this together, Jean-Luc told his wife, voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could strip paint. The nobles need our taxes to maintain their essential work of... What is it they do again? Ah, yes, he remembered. Existing, decoratively. The truly marvelous thing about the Ancien Regime was how everyone understood the system was perfect. Absolutely perfect. So perfect, in fact, that any suggestion of change was clearly the work of troublemakers and malcontents. Take the parliaments, for instance. These noble law courts spent their days bravely defending ancient privileges against any hint of reform. When finance ministers occasionally suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, the aristocracy might contribute a franc or two to the national coffers, the parliaments would throw themselves upon this assault on tradition with the fury of a cat defending its saucer of cream. The very foundations of society, they'd cry. The natural order, they insisted. As if the Almighty himself had decreed that the Duc de Wherever should own 17 chateaux, while Pierre the ploughman couldn't afford shoes. Yes, France, before the Revolution, was a paradise of social cohesion. Everyone pulling together in the same direction. The fact that said direction involved the vast majority pulling the tiny minority around in gilded carriages was neither here nor there. And if the odd philosophy muttered about reason and natural rights in their coffee houses, well, what harm could a few books possibly do? Chapter 2. Philosophical Picnics and the Dawn of Universal Understanding. While the peasants were busy perfecting the art of starvation, Paris's intellectual elite had discovered something far more nourishing: ideas. Dangerous, subversive, thoroughly unreasonable ideas that suggested, brace yourselves, that perhaps being born into the right uterus shouldn't determine your entire life's trajectory. The salons of Paris hummed with the kind of energy usually reserved for public executions, which, ironically, they'd soon be getting plenty of. But for now, it was all powdered wigs and passionate debate, fueled by enough coffee to float a merchantman. "Gentlemen," cried Antoine de l'Esprit, a young intellectual whose enthusiasm exceeded his facial hair by a considerable margin. "I have just finished Rousseau's Social Contract, and I am positively vibrating with enlightenment." He brandished the book like Moses with his tablets, though considerably less divine and infinitely more caffeinated. "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains," he declared. "The solution is gloriously simple. We must return to the general will." "The general will?" his companion muttered, adjusting his spectacles, "which presumably doesn't include the will to keep one's head attached to one's shoulders," he mused. "But do go on." "Oh, these philosophies, such delightful optimists. They genuinely believed that if you simply explained to the aristocracy that their entire existence was a crime against natural law, they'd graciously step aside. Ah, yes. The nobles would surely say, "How silly of us. Here, take our chateau. We'll go until the fields immediately." Voltaire had started it all, the troublemaker, hiding away in Ferney, firing off letters that scorched their way across Europe. Écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing. The church wasn't particularly amused. Neither were the various monarchs who found themselves on the receiving end of his wit, which was sharper than a well-maintained guillotine blade. Not that anyone had invented those yet. Give it time. In a dim presbytery in rural Provence, Father Bernard squinted at a letter from his bishop. These new ideas spreading from Paris concerned the church deeply. Deeply enough to actually wake the bishop from his post-luncheon stupor. Deism, the old curé spat, as if the word tasted of sulfur. They acknowledge God exists, but claim he wound up the universe like a clock and wandered off. No miracles, no divine intervention, no proper fear of damnation. What's next, he wondered. Suggesting the meek shan't inherit the earth? He glanced at his congregation's ledger, the widow Dupont, who hadn't a sou to her name but never missed Mass. Young Pierre, who'd lost 3 fingers in the mill but still crossed himself with the remaining 2. These philosophers spoke of liberty and equality from their silk-cushioned chairs, but who would comfort his flock when reason proved cold company in the dark night of the soul? "Mark my words," he muttered to his empty church. "This enlightenment will plunge us all into darkness." Back in Paris, the ideas kept flowing faster than wine at a nobleman's banquet. The encyclopedia, 28 volumes of knowledge that dared to suggest that understanding the world didn't require a priest as intermediary. Shocking. Next, they'd be claiming the earth went round the sun. Oh, wait, they were claiming that too. Diderot, the encyclopedia's chief architect, had spent 20 years of his life assembling this monument to human knowledge. 20 years of battles with censors who had the charming habit of throwing you in the Bastille for suggesting that maybe, just maybe, thinking for yourself wasn't actually heretical. Knowledge is power, the philosophers declared, apparently not noticing that the people with actual power were remarkably uninterested in sharing it. Still, the ideas spread like a particularly virulent cold. From salon to coffeehouse, from pamphlet to clandestine printing press. The authorities tried to stop it, bless them. Book burnings, imprisonments, the occasional strongly worded decree. Might as well try to stop the tide with a tennis racket. The genie was out of the bottle, and it had opinions about taxation without representation. Antoine de l'Esprit was practically glowing as he held court in Café Procope. Soon, mes amis, he proclaimed, reason shall reign supreme. No more superstition, no more arbitrary power, no more tips, the serving girl grumbled, clearing away his empty cup. These philosophers all talk of equality until the bill arrives. But Antoine didn't hear. He was too busy imagining the glorious future where all men would be brothers, united in rational discourse and mutual respect. The fact that his glorious future would involve rather more decapitation than decoration hadn't occurred to him yet. Ideas are funny things. You can't execute them, can't exile them, can't lock them in the Bastille. Once they're loose, they spread like spilled wine on a white tablecloth. And France's tablecloth was about to get very, very stained indeed. Chapter 3, The Estates General, a model of cooperative governance and swift agreement. By 1789, France's finances were in what economists technically call a complete pig's breakfast. The American Revolution, which France had generously funded out of spite for Britain, had left the royal coffers emptier than Louis XVI's understanding of economics. "Gentlemen," announced Finance Minister Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who'd made the fatal error of being competent, "we need new taxes." The nobles and clergy exchanged glances of such synchronized horror you'd think he'd suggested they take up manual labor. Tax the privileged? Unprecedented, unthinkable, un-French. And so, in a moment of spectacular miscalculation that would make betting your life savings on a three-legged horse look prudent, Louis XVI called the Estates General. It hadn't met since 1614. What could possibly have changed in a mere 175 years? "The king seeks our counsel," gasped Henri Beaumont, a minor lawyer from Toulouse who'd somehow found himself elected to represent the Third Estate. He clutched his credentials like a golden ticket to Versailles' chocolate factory. "Finally," he declared, "our grievances will be heard." Oh, Henry. Sweet, naive Henry. He'd spent weeks gathering his constituents' complaints into neat little notebooks called Cahiers de Doléances. Page after page of extremely reasonable requests like, "Could we perhaps eat occasionally?" and "Might the tax burden be distributed more fairly than a rigged carnival game?" The nobility had their own ideas about fair distribution, namely, that the current system where they distributed nothing was perfectly fair already. Thank you very much. The Comtesse de Très Fatigué surveyed the arriving deputies with the expression of someone who'd discovered mouse droppings in their sugar bowl. "Look at them," she murmured to her companion. "Lawyers and merchants playing at government," she added. "Like giving a violin to a chimpanzee and expecting Mozart." The great hall at Versailles buzzed with more nervous energy than a hive of caffeinated bees. 1,200 men, divided by estate, united in absolutely nothing except their magnificent ability to disagree about everything. "Now then," the king said, in what he presumably thought was a commanding tone but came out more like a tentative suggestion, "let's discuss the tax situation." The First and Second Estates nodded sagely. Yes, the Third Estate should definitely pay more taxes, Problem solved. Meeting adjourned. Lunch, anyone? But then came the awkward question of voting. By tradition, each estate got one vote. 2 aristocratic estates versus 1 everyone else estate. Democracy at its finest. Like asking 2 wolves and a sheep to vote on dinner arrangements. Preposterous, cried the Third Estate. We represent 98% of France. Precisely why you shouldn't be trusted with decisions. A duke countered, whose main qualification for governance was emerging from the correct birth canal. One doesn't let the passengers steer the ship. Days passed, then weeks. The deputies of the Third Estate, locked out of their meeting hall by a petty bit of royal furniture rearrangement, found themselves standing in a tennis court. Because nothing says serious political reform quite like conducting affairs of state where people usually argued about volleys. "Gentlemen," someone shouted, who'd clearly had enough. "We swear to never separate until France has a constitution." And there it was, the tennis court oath. 600 men pledging to remake France while standing where aristocrats usually played recreational sports. The irony was delicious enough to serve at Versailles. "We are making history," Henry Beaumont cried, actual tears in his eyes, blissfully unaware that history has a nasty habit of making people right back. The king, displaying the political acumen of a concussed sheep, decided the solution was to hold a royal session. He would simply tell everyone what to do, and they would do it. Because that had worked so splendidly thus far. "The 3 orders shall continue to meet separately," Louis declared with all the authority of a substitute teacher facing a rowdy class. The Third Estate's response was essentially a collective no. Just no. They declared themselves the National Assembly and invited the other estates to join them or jog on. Some clergy, displaying a shocking understanding of which way the wind was blowing, actually did join. Even a few nobles, probably the ones who could count and realize 3% of the population couldn't hold out forever against 98%. "Treason," sputtered the Comtesse. "Absolute treason. Next, they'll be suggesting that worth comes from merit rather than birth." "Don't be ridiculous," her companion replied, fanning herself furiously. "That would be like suggesting servants are actual people." Meanwhile, in Paris, bread prices hit new heights and patience hit new lows. The people watched their representatives with the kind of hope usually reserved for lottery tickets. Surely this time things would change. The assembly kept talking, and talking, and talking. Democracy, it turned out, involved an awful lot of discussion. Who knew that getting 1,200 men to agree on anything would be like herding cats through a thunderstorm? But they persevered, bless them, hammering out the details of a new France, while the old France watched in horror and reached for the smelling salts, or in some cases for the nearest regiment of Swiss guards. Chapter 4. The Bastille Day Fête, a spontaneous community refurbishment project. July in Paris. The air hung thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and revolution. Bread prices had reached levels that would make a loan shark blush. The king had dismissed Necker, the one minister who seemed to grasp that "let them eat cake." wasn't actually a viable economic policy. Then came the rumor. Troops were massing around Paris. Foreign mercenaries, no less. Because nothing says, "I trust my people," quite like hiring Swiss and German soldiers to point muskets at them. "They mean to dissolve the assembly," cried someone in the crowd at the Palais Royal. "They mean to massacre us all," another shouted. Now, whether the king actually intended this or was simply engaging in his usual level of political competence, that is to say, none whatsoever, hardly mattered. Paris believed it. And Paris was in no mood for rational discussion. Jean-Luc the baker found himself swept along in a tide of humanity. One moment he'd been trying to source affordable flour. The next he was marching with thousands toward the Invalides, where weapons were stored. "Citizens," someone shouted, "we need arms to defend the assembly." Defend the assembly. 3 weeks ago, Jean-Luc hadn't known what an assembly was. Now, he was ready to die for one. Funny how empty bellies could clarify one's political priorities. They found muskets at the Invalides. 30,000 of them. Lovely. Just one small problem. No gunpowder. And where was the gunpowder? Why, in the Bastille, of course. That charming medieval fortress, squatting in the Eastern District like a stone toad. The Bastille, symbol of royal oppression, where the king could imprison anyone, any time, for any reason or no reason, where the dreaded lettre de cachet sent you to rot without trial. Never mind that it currently held exactly 7 prisoners, including a gentleman who thought he was Julius Caesar and another there at his family's request. Citizen Dubois, a wine merchant turned Revolutionary Committee member, surveyed the gathering crowd with satisfaction. "Today, mes amis," he proclaimed, "we strike a blow for liberty." Someone handed him a musket. He'd never held one before. How hard could it be? Point the loud end at tyranny and pull the trigger. Politics made simple. The fortress's governor, Bernard-René Delaunay, watched the crowd approach with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd brought a knife to a cannon fight. Which, technically, he had. Several cannons, actually. Fat lot of good they'd do against his own countrymen. "Perhaps," suggested one of his officers, "we could negotiate." Ah, yes, negotiation. That famous French pastime where both sides talk past each other until someone starts shooting, which is precisely what happened. Who fired first? Nobody knew. Nobody cared. Suddenly, the air filled with musket balls and revolutionary fervor. The crowd, displaying the kind of tactical brilliance that would later characterize much of the revolution, decided to charge a medieval fortress with their bare hands and optimism. Jean-Luc found himself pressed against the outer wall, clutching a pike he'd acquired from God knows where. "What are we doing?" he shouted to the man next to him. "Liberating France," came the reply. "By attacking a wall?" Jean-Luc asked. "Shut up and look patriotic," the man shot back. Inside, Delaunay was having what military historians call a very bad day. His 100-odd defenders faced thousands of increasingly angry Parisians. His options were A. Slaughter French citizens and go down in history as a monster, or B. Surrender and probably die anyway. He chose C. Dither about it until the decision was made for him. The Swiss guards in the crowd, deserters who'd joined the people, knew about the fortress's weakness. Soon, the drawbridge was down, and in poured the human tide, revolutionary enthusiasm making up for what they lacked in military training. "Victory!" screamed Citizen Dubois, waving his musket like a conductor's baton. "The Bastille is ours." The 7 prisoners emerged, blinking in the sunlight. Caesar rendered unto the crowd. The Marquis de Sade would have been there too, but he'd been transferred 10 days earlier. Timing, as they say, is everything. And poor Delaunay? Well, let's just say his head and body decided to part company, quite literally. The crowd, in their enthusiasm for liberty, equality, and fraternity, demonstrated their brotherhood by mounting his head on a pike. Nothing says, "We're the good guys," quite like amateur decapitation. A glorious day for France. Citizen Dubois proclaimed later, trying not to think about the bits of governor he'd seen decorating the streets. "We've shown the tyrants that the people will not be oppressed." Jean-Luc made his way home, pike still in hand, mind reeling. He'd gone out for flour and come back a revolutionary. His wife would never believe this. "Did you get the bread?" she asked as he stumbled through the door. "No," he said, "but I helped storm a fortress and possibly committed treason." "Can we eat treason?" she inquired. "Probably not," Jean-Luc admitted. She sighed. Then tomorrow, she told him, maybe focus on the bread. But there would be no going back. The Bastille had fallen, and with it, something fundamental in the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. The king had been defied. Royal authority had crumbled like a weak old baguette. The revolution wasn't coming anymore. It was here. Chapter 5. The Declaration of Rights. Unanimous applause and immediate social bliss. August 1789. The National Assembly, drunk on their own audacity and possibly some actual wine, decided to pen a little document. Nothing fancy. Just a complete philosophical dismantling of everything France had stood for since Charlemagne was in short trousers. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, they declared, apparently forgetting to check with the people who'd been running things on the opposite principle for the past 1,000 years. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Even the title was revolutionary. Not the rights of nobles, not the rights of Frenchmen, but of man, capital M, universal. As if a peasant in Provence had anything in common with a duke in Dijon beyond the ability to bleed when stabbed. In her Parisian townhouse, the Comtesse de Très-Fatigué nearly choked on her morning chocolate. Equal in rights? Equal? She sputtered. She fanned herself so vigorously her lady's maid feared for the structural integrity of the fan. "Next, they'll be saying my chambermaid has the right to an opinion," she fumed. The chambermaid in question, Marie Claire, kept her eyes downcast and her opinions to herself. She'd learned long ago that the only right servants truly had was the right to remain silent and fetch things. Still, she'd heard whispers in the market. This declaration, these new ideas, equal in rights. The words tasted strange, like foreign sweets. Article 6. The town crier read in the square, his voice competing with the fish sellers and the cart wheels. Law is the expression of the general will. Every citizen has a right to participate personally, or through his representative, in its foundation. Adele the laundress paused in her washing. Participate in lawmaking? Her? She couldn't even read, though she was working on that, slowly, secretly, by candlelight when the washing was done. But the idea that her voice might matter? That was more revolutionary than all the gunpowder at the Bastille. What rubbish, the woman next to her spat, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn stain. Equal in rights. Tell that to my landlord when the rent's due. Tell that to the baker when I haven't got coin for bread. Rights don't fill empty bellies, she finished. But Adele wondered. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but perhaps someday these pretty words might mean something. Perhaps her daughter wouldn't have to wash other people's small clothes until her hands were raw. Perhaps. The assembly, meanwhile, was having a marvelous time playing philosopher. Liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. They threw around concepts like confetti at a wedding, apparently unaware that weddings sometimes end in divorce, messy ones. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, they proclaimed, not in the king, in the nation. Louis XVI, upon hearing this, displayed his usual political acuity by going hunting. When in doubt, shoot something with antlers. It's clearer than politics. Of course, there were a few tiny oversights in this magnificent declaration. Women, for instance. Half the population, conveniently forgotten. When Olympe de Gouges would later pen her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, she'd be told to pipe down, and then eventually to put her head in a lunette. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And slaves? Those suffering in French colonies? Well, men are born free and equal, apparently came with significant geographic restrictions. Sugar plantations in Saint-Domingue didn't count. The money they generated, however, counted very much indeed. 17 articles, mused Henri Beaumont, our idealistic deputy from Toulouse. He sat in his modest lodgings, copying out the declaration by candlelight. His hand trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the sheer audacity of what they'd done. We've challenged God, his landlady had gasped when she heard. Saying all men are equal, God made kings and commoners different, didn't he? She asked. Henry didn't know how to explain that maybe, just maybe, God had been getting the blame for what men had decided all along. That divine right was awfully convenient for those who claimed to have it. In Versailles, the court pretended everything was normal. The Comtesse attended another tedious card party, where the main entertainment was pretending the world wasn't changing outside the gates. These rights, the Duc de something, or other drawled, are they transferable? Can one sell them? Because I'd happily buy the peasant's rights to resistance. Save such trouble later, he concluded. Everyone laughed. That brittle, tinkling laugh of people whistling past a graveyard. The declaration was just words, after all. And what were words against centuries of tradition, against the natural order of things? But words, as the aristocracy would learn, could be more dangerous than cannon fire. You could rebuild a wall. You couldn't unbuild an idea. And the idea that all men were born equal, however imperfectly expressed, however partially applied, was now loose in the world. Like a virus, some would say. Like a dawn, said others. Either way, there was no putting it back in the bottle. The Declaration of Rights was France's promise to itself. That things could be different, would be different. Whether France could keep that promise? Well, that remained to be seen. Chapter 6. A Royal Picnic. The King's thoughtful attempt at connecting with nature and Austria. By June 1791, Louis XVI had reached a conclusion that would have occurred to smarter men considerably earlier. Being a constitutional monarch was significantly less fun than being an absolute one. Rather like going from an all-you-can-eat buffet to a strict diet of gruel and criticism. The royal family had been moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. For their protection, the Assembly said. Protection. That's what they called being under constant watch by people who viewed you with all the warm affection usually reserved for infectious diseases. "I think," the king announced to his wife one evening, "we should take a little trip." Marie Antoinette looked up from her embroidery. "To the countryside?" she asked. "How delightful. A picnic, perhaps?" "Something like that," Louis replied, neglecting to mention that their picnic basket would contain the crown jewels and their destination would be the Austrian Netherlands. Details, details. The plan was simplicity itself. Dress as servants, sneak out at night, dash to the frontier where loyal troops waited. What could possibly go wrong? It wasn't as if the King of France had one of the most recognizable profiles in Europe. Oh, wait. Captain Francois Bouillet, waiting at the frontier with his troops, checked his pocket watch for the 100th time. His Majesty was supposed to arrive by dawn. It was now noon. Either the royal family had been delayed, or they'd decided to take the scenic route through every village in northeastern France, while dressed as the least convincing servants in theatrical history. Perhaps, his lieutenant suggested, traveling in a bright yellow Berline coach with the royal coat of arms hastily painted over wasn't the subtlest of escape vehicles. Bouillet glared at him. When this was over, someone would need to explain to their majesties the basic principles of incognito. Meanwhile, in the town of Saint-Ménehould, postmaster Jean-Baptiste Drouet was having a peculiar day. A coach had stopped to change horses. Nothing unusual there. Except the servant in the coach looked remarkably like the fellow on the assignat banknotes. You know, the King of France. "No," his wife said when he mentioned it. "Don't be daft," she told him. "What would the king be doing here, dressed like that?" But Drouet had been a soldier. He knew that face. And, more importantly, he knew what catching a fleeing monarch might mean for a humble postmaster's career prospects. By Varennes, the game was up. The town authorities, alerted by Drouet's frantic riding, stopped the coach. Inside, they found a valet who kept forgetting to act servile, a governess dripping with diamonds, and 2 children who'd clearly never been within 10 feet of actual work. "I demand you let us pass," the king said, forgetting he was supposed to be Monsieur Durand, valet to a Russian baroness. The procurator of Varennes, a grocer named Sauce, yes, really, found himself in the unenviable position of arresting God's anointed representative on earth. Or at least, God's somewhat portly and confused representative who'd apparently never heard of traveling light. "Your Majesty," Source said, trying to be respectful while also, arresting him. "I'm afraid you'll have to come back to Paris." "This is intolerable," Marie Antoinette burst out. "We are your king and queen." "Yes, madame," Source replied. "That's rather the problem." Back in Paris, the Assembly was having what politicians call a bit of a situation. The king had fled, the same king who'd sworn to uphold the Constitution. The same king they'd been pretending still had everyone's trust and affection. He was clearly kidnapped, some deputies declared, displaying the kind of creative thinking that would serve them well in politics. "Kidnapped into a coach full of his own luggage," others replied. Citizen Dubois, our wine merchant turned revolutionary, was more direct. The Austrian woman and her puppet husband showed their true colors. He exclaimed, "They fled to join our enemies. This is treason, pure and simple." But what to do? Declaring the king a traitor meant admitting the constitutional monarchy was a sham. Not declaring him a traitor meant pretending that taking a heavily armed midnight stroll toward enemy territory was perfectly normal royal behavior. The journey back to Paris was a funeral procession in all but name. Crowds lined the roads, staring in sullen silence. The fiction of royal popularity lay shattered like the coach windows some enterprising patriots had broken. Henry Beaumont watched the royal coach pass, his idealistic heart breaking a little. He'd believed, truly believed, they could reform France together. King and people united in constitutional harmony. Instead, he watched a failed fugitive being hauled back like a common criminal. "So much for the father of the nation," someone spat. At the Tuileries, they reinstalled the royal family in their gilded cage. Guards were tripled, the pretense maintained, but everyone knew something fundamental had changed. You can't stuff the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't uncatch a fleeing king. The Comtesse, receiving the news in her salon, fainted dramatically. When revived, she muttered, "If His Majesty had only consulted people of quality, this never would have happened. Dressed as servants, the very idea." Missing the point with such spectacular precision was, perhaps, the aristocracy's greatest talent. Chapter 7. Proactive Sanitation. Keeping the prisons tidy during a time of national fervor. September 1792 arrived with news that would have made even the most optimistic revolutionary reach for the wine. The Prussians had invaded. The Duke of Brunswick, with all the diplomatic finesse of a bull in a china shop, had issued a manifesto promising to level Paris if anyone so much as looked at the royal family funny. Paris responded to this threat with characteristic reason and restraint, which is to say, they completely lost their minds. "The enemy is at the gates," screamed the headlines. Well, 60 miles from the gates, but why let geography spoil a good panic? The Prussians were coming, the émigrés were plotting, and the prisons were full of their accomplices, or so the story went. Citizen Marat, that delightful fellow who spent his days calling for blood and his nights in a medicinal bath, had a simple solution. "Empty the prisons," he cried. Not through release, you understand, through what he charmingly termed popular justice. The prisons of Paris held a fascinating mix in those days. Actual counter-revolutionaries, certainly, but also common criminals, debtors, priests who'd refused to swear the constitutional oath, and anyone who'd looked suspicious to their neighborhood watch committee, which in revolutionary Paris could mean wearing too fancy a hat. On September 2nd, the sanitation project began. A mob arrived at the Abbey prison with the kind of organizational efficiency that suggested this wasn't entirely spontaneous. They had lists. They had weapons. They had revolutionary fervor coming out of their ears. "Citizens," shouted their leader, a butcher who'd found his true calling. "We cannot march to face the enemy while leaving vipers at our backs. Justice must be swift." Justice, in this case, involved hauling prisoners before impromptu tribunals that made kangaroo courts look like models of jurisprudence. The trial usually went something like this. "You are accused of conspiracy against the nation. How do you plead?" the judge would ask. "Not guilty," the prisoner might cry. "I'm here for debt." "Likely story," the judge would declare. "To the courtyard with him." The courtyard, where justice was dispensed with pikes, sabers, and hammers, where the cobblestones ran red and the September sun watched it all with cosmic indifference. Jean-Luc, our baker turned reluctant revolutionary, found himself pressed into guard duty at La Force prison. He'd wanted no part of this, but refusing wasn't exactly an option when your neighbors were watching for signs of insufficient patriotism. "Just stand there and look fierce," they told him. Easy to say, harder to do when you're watching a 19-year-old seamstress tried for the crime of mending aristocratic underwear. She stood before the tribunal, trembling like a leaf. "I just sewed what they paid me to sew," she whispered. "Collaboration," roared the judge, a wine merchant drunk on power and possibly actual wine. "You strengthened the enemies of the people with your needle." Jean-Luc closed his eyes as they dragged her away. The revolution he'd joined had been about bread and justice. This was neither. This was madness wearing the mask of patriotism. At the Carmelite convent, they slaughtered priests who'd refused the constitutional oath. Their crime, believing their first loyalty was to God rather than the assembly. Revolutionary mathematics. God minus state equals death. "For the nation," the killers shouted, as if naming the demon would sanctify the slaughter. Among the victims was the Princesse de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's friend. After killing her, they did things that would make a medieval torturer blanch. Her head, on a pike, was paraded beneath the Queen's window. "Look," they cried. "See how the people treat their enemies?" Marie Antoinette fainted. Even for a queen who'd seen much, this was too much. The mob cheered. Nothing says liberty, equality, fraternity quite like waving severed heads at grieving friends. Citizen Dubois, watching from his committee room, felt his revolutionary certainty waver. "This is necessary," he told himself. "Regrettable but necessary. The Republic must defend itself." But did defending the Republic require murdering prostitutes and pickpockets? Did it require killing that 10-year-old drummer boy whose only crime was serving in the wrong regiment? For 5 days, the massacre continued. The Assembly, that body of enlightened lawmakers, did precisely nothing. Some members muttered disapproval, others actively encouraged it. Most just looked the other way and hoped it would stop on its own. The people in their righteous anger, they said, as if the people were some uncontrollable force of nature rather than their constituents with sharp objects. By the time the bloodlust exhausted itself, between 1,000 and 1,400 were dead. The exact number remains unclear. Revolutionary bookkeeping was more enthusiastic than accurate. "A glorious victory for the Republic," proclaimed Marat from his bathtub. "Easy to call for blood when you're not the one mopping it up." Henri Beaumont, our idealistic deputy, sat in his rooms, head in hands. Is this what their Declaration of Rights had wrought? Is this what resistance to oppression looked like? If so, perhaps oppression had its merits. The September massacres, they'd call them later, as if giving them a name could contain the horror. As if massacre was just another revolutionary festival, like the Festival of Reason or the Festival of the Supreme Being. Paris cleaned its cobblestones and pretended nothing had happened. The revolution marched on, leaving bloody footprints in its wake. After all, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Even if some of those eggs were only guilty of being in the wrong basket at the wrong time. Chapter 8. Dr. Guillotine's marvelous device for painless national consensus. Ah, the guillotine. That triumph of Enlightenment engineering. Because if you're going to separate heads from bodies on an industrial scale, you might as well be efficient about it. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a man whose name would become synonymous with decisive conflict resolution, had only wanted to make execution more humane. "Gentlemen," he told the Assembly back in 1789, "if we must have capital punishment, let it be swift and equal for all. No more hanging for commoners while nobles get the sword. Democracy demands democratic death." How touchingly egalitarian. The good doctor had envisioned his machine used perhaps a dozen times a year. A few murderers here, a traitor there. He certainly hadn't imagined it would become Paris's hardest-working civil servant, processing more heads than a wig shop during Fashion Week. By 1793, the guillotine had been relocated to the Place de la Révolution, where the crowds could get a better view. Because nothing says civic engagement quite like turning public execution into a spectator sport. Madame Guillotine, they called her, the national razor, the patriotic shortener. The French do love their nicknames, especially for things that kill you. Jacques the carpenter, who'd helped build the scaffolds, watched the daily processions with increasing unease. He'd been proud at first, craftsmanship in the service of justice. But justice seemed to have developed an insatiable appetite. "Another load today," his apprentice noted, counting the tumbrils rolling past. "That's 43. "Don't count," Jacques muttered, "and don't stare. These days, looking too interested is suspicious. Looking not interested enough is also suspicious. Best to perfect the expression of mild patriotic approval," he advised. The crowds had their regulars, the tricotises, those charming ladies who combined their knitting with bloodlust, clicking their needles in rhythm with the falling blade. Stitch 1, purl 2, off with his head. "I'm making stockings for the army," one would say, needles flying. "Each pair represents another aristo gone to meet his maker." "How patriotic," her neighbor would reply. I'm doing mittens. One thumb for the Republic, one thumb less for its enemies, she added. The condemned had 24 hours between sentence and execution. Just enough time to write a last letter, make peace with whatever deities still accepted revolutionary prayers, and practice keeping their dignity while riding backwards in a cart. Some went nobly. The Marquis de Custine stepped up to the scaffold like he was ascending to his box at the opera. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I die for France, the France that was, and the France that might have been." Others went less gracefully. The Comtesse de Très Fatiguée, when her time came, fainted at the sight of the machine. They had to carry her up. "This is most improper." She gasped as they positioned her. "I haven't been introduced to the executioner." Even in death, etiquette mattered. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, was a professional, third-generation family business. He wore a top hat and maintained the gravity befitting a civil servant, no personal animosity. Just a man doing his job. Pull the lever, clean the blade, next please. The machine is very efficient, he'd tell anyone who asked. No suffering, quick as falling asleep, though presumably with less chance of waking up refreshed. The scaffold developed its own economy. People sold programs listing the days condemned. Enterprising vendors hawked refreshments. "Lemonade! Get your patriotic lemonade," a vendor cried, sweetened with the tears of aristocrats. Parents brought their children, educational outings. "See, little Pierre," a father would say, "this is what happens to enemies of the people." "But Papa," the boy would ask, "what makes someone an enemy of the people?" "Hush," the father would reply. Questions like that, mostly. The guillotine was remarkably democratic. They'd give it that. It took the high and the low with equal efficiency. Louis XVI discovered this in January 1793. One moment a king, the next moment considerably shorter. He'd tried to make a final speech, but the drums drowned him out. Something about innocence and forgiveness. The crowd wasn't in a forgiving mood. When his head fell, some rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the royal blood. Souvenirs of the day God's anointed met Republican steel. "So passes tyranny," Citizen Dubois shouted, though privately he felt queasy. Killing a king was rather like killing your father. Even if your father was an incompetent fool who'd bankrupted the family. Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later. They'd cut her hair, dressed her in white, made her ride in the common cart. The woman who'd once spent a fortune on hairdressing now wore the Republican haircut, short at the neck for convenience. She stepped on the executioner's foot, climbing the scaffold. "Pardon me, monsieur," she said. "I did not mean to." Apologizing to her executioner. Manners to the very end. Though one suspects the irony was lost on the crowd baying for her blood. Adele, the laundress, watched from the back of the crowd. She'd hated the Queen once. The Austrian, the spendthrift, the symbol of everything wrong with France. But watching this gray-haired woman mount the scaffold with quiet dignity, Adele felt something crack inside her. "Are we any better?" she whispered to herself. "Have we become what we fought against?" But such thoughts were dangerous. The guillotine's appetite grew daily. First the royals, then the aristocrats, then the moderate Republicans, then anyone who suggested that perhaps maybe they were overdoing it a bit. Dr. Guillotine himself avoided public places. His name had become a verb. To guillotine, to be guillotine. He wanted to give France humane execution. Instead, he'd given it a death factory. Efficiency, it turned out, could be a curse. When killing became too easy, people found more reasons to do it. Chapter 9. The Committee of Public Safety, ensuring everyone felt really secure. In April 1793, the National Convention created something called the Committee of Public Safety, because nothing says safety quite like an organization that would make citizens wake in cold sweats at the sound of a door knock. 12 men tasked with saving the Republic. From what? From everything. Foreign enemies, internal dissent, insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, incorrect pronunciation of citoyenne. The threats were everywhere, which conveniently justified the committee being everywhere too. Enter Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, a man so virtuous he made saints look morally flexible. Lawyer from Arras, neat as a pin, couldn't pass a mirror without checking his powder. Democracy's most fastidious fanatic. Citizens, he proclaimed in that voice like ice cracking. Terror is nothing but justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Ah, yes, virtue, that quality best expressed through mass execution. Socrates would have been so proud. The committee met in the green room of the Tuileries, 12 men around a table, deciding who lived and who died. Like the world's deadliest dinner party, except nobody ate because Robespierre thought excessive dining was counter-revolutionary. Citizen Fouché reports suspicious activity in Lyon, Carnot would announce, shuffling papers. Define suspicious, Saint, Just would reply. At 25, he was the baby of the group, also possibly the most terrifying. The Angel of Death, they called him. Angels apparently came with excellent cheekbones and a complete absence of mercy. They're not executing enough people, Carnot explained. Ah, Saint just responded. Clear, counter-revolutionary tendencies. Send them a list of suggested victims and more guillotines. Because when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When your only tool is a guillotine, everything looks like a neck. Jean-Baptiste Carrier got sent to Nantes with simple instructions: suppress the rebellion. He interpreted this creatively. Why waste time with individual executions when you could load prisoners onto barges, sail them to the middle of the Loire, and sink them? Republican marriages, he called them, tying a man and woman together before drowning them. See? Romance wasn't dead, just the romantics. Back in Paris, the law of suspects made everyone potentially guilty. Suspect of what? Of being suspect. The circular logic would have been amusing if it hadn't come with a death sentence. Henry Beaumont, our increasingly disillusioned deputy, sat through session after session as the definitions expanded. First, it was émigrés and refractory priests, then relatives of émigrés, then friends of relatives of émigrés, then people who'd once bought bread from someone whose cousin knew an émigré. Where does it end? He whispered to a colleague. Shh, the colleague replied. Do you want to be suspected of sympathy for suspects? The committee had eyes everywhere. A vast network of surveillance committees, revolutionary committees, committees to watch the committees. France became a nation of watchers, watching the watchers. Citizen Mouchet made a tidy living from denunciations. That baker who gave short weight, counter-revolutionary sabotage. The woman who sighed during a patriotic speech, royalist sympathies. His neighbor who'd beaten him at cards, definitely plotting something. I serve the Republic, he'd say, pocketing his reward. 30 pieces of silver had inflation adjusted nicely. The committee's reach extended beyond mere execution. They controlled prices, requisitioned grain, conscripted armies. Total war required total control. Maximum prices for maximum heads rolling. The Republic must live, Robespierre insisted, adjusting his green-tinted glasses. And for the Republic to live, its enemies must die. The arithmetic was simple, the application less so. How many enemies could a republic have before it ran out of citizens? In his modest apartment, Robespierre lived like a monk. No luxuries, no mistresses, no joy. Just virtue, virtue, and more virtue. He ate virtue for breakfast and dreamed virtuous dreams. Presumably, about more efficient ways to spread virtue via decapitation. You cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs, his colleague Collot d'Herbois observed. How many eggs? Someone dared ask. And who decides which eggs need breaking? Dangerous questions, the kind that could land you in the egg basket yourself. The terror had its own vocabulary. Enemies of the people, aristocrats of wealth, moderates, that deadliest of sins. In revolutionary mathematics, moderate equaled traitor. You were either blazing with patriotic fervor or you were kindling. Marie Claire, the Comtesse's former chambermaid, now worked in a munitions factory. Equal rights hadn't meant equal food or equal safety, but equal opportunity to lose your head for saying the wrong thing. Keep your mouth shut and your hands busy, the forewoman advised. The committee likes productive patriots. So Marie Claire made gunpowder and kept her opinions to herself. Though sometimes, late at night, she wondered if the old days were really so bad. At least then you knew where you stood. Under the aristocrats' heels, yes, but alive under them. The Committee of Public Safety, keeping France safe from itself, one severed head at a time. Because nothing says public safety quite like making the public terrified to speak, think, or breathe incorrectly. Still, they were efficient. You had to give them that. By the time they were done, France would be extremely safe. Safe from having too many citizens anyway. Chapter 10. Theological Renovations. Streamlining Worship for a Modern Age. Having successfully reorganized French politics through the simple expedient of killing everyone who disagreed, the revolution turned its attention to an even trickier customer, God, or rather, getting rid of him. Because, apparently, overthrowing the monarchy wasn't ambitious enough. Citizens, proclaimed the Paris Commune. For too long, superstition has clouded your minds. No more shall priests fill your heads with fairy tales. The only trinity you need is liberty, equality, and fraternity. Poor Father Bernard, the provincial curé we met earlier, watched in horror as revolutionary commissioners arrived in his village. They'd come to liberate his parishioners from the tyranny of eternal salvation. "Hand over your chalices, citizen," they demanded. "The Republic needs metal more than your God needs golden cups." But this is sacrilege," he cried. "No, citizen," one replied. "This is patriotism. Now strip that lead from your roof. The Republic needs bullets." And so churches became arsenals. Bells were melted for cannon. Saints' statues made excellent target practice. 2,000 years of Christianity in France reduced to scrap metal and kindling. Efficiency at its finest. In Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral got a makeover. Out went the Virgin Mary. In came the Goddess of Reason. Played, naturally, by an actress from the opera. Because nothing says rational thought quite like worshipping a woman in a toga pretending to be an abstract concept. The actress, Mademoiselle Maillard, found the whole thing rather amusing. Yesterday, I played Aphrodite. Today, Reason. Tomorrow, who knows? She mused. Perhaps common sense, though that role's getting harder to cast in Paris. Churches across France became temples of reason. The Christian calendar? Abolished. No more saints' days, no more Sundays. Instead, a rational 10-day week with rational names like Primidi and Decadi, because nothing improves productivity like making workers wait 10 days for a day off. The new calendar had months like Thermidor, hot, Brumaire, foggy, and Ventose, windy. Poetry by committee. Days were dedicated to vegetables, tools, and virtues. The 5th of carrot, the 10th of pitchfork, the 15th of civic duty, romantic. "But when is Christmas?" asked confused citizens. "There is no Christmas, citizen," came the reply. "Only the festival of turnips on what you used to call December 25th. Priests faced a delightful choice. Swear an oath to the Constitution or lose your job. Many chose unemployment. The smart ones chose exile. The stubborn ones chose martyrdom, though not by choice. Jean-Luc the baker tried to make sense of it all. "So God is illegal now?" he asked. "Not illegal," the local commissioner explained. "Just unnecessary, like kings, and decent bread, apparently. But you can't simply legislate away a millennium of faith. In the countryside, peasants hid their priests like contraband. Mass was celebrated in barns, forests, anywhere but churches. The body of Christ distributed like black market goods." "This is madness," whispered Catherine Moreau, attending midnight mass in a cowshed. "What harm did the Virgin ever do to the Republic?" "She promoted monarchy," someone replied. "Queen of Heaven and all that. Very counter-revolutionary." The revolution's war on God had its comedic moments. In one town, revolutionaries ceremoniously married a priest to a nun to show their liberation from celibacy vows. The fact that both parties were in their 70s and thoroughly uninterested in consummation rather spoiled the symbolic gesture. Then came the cult of the Supreme Being. Because Robespierre, that walking advertisement for the joys of atheism, decided France needed some kind of deity after all, just not the Christian one, something more Republican. The Supreme Being, he announced, acknowledges the immortality of the soul and the necessity of virtue. How convenient. A God who agreed with everything Robespierre said, divine endorsement of the terror. Truly, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Churches were redecorated. Out went reason, so last season, in came the Supreme Being. Walls were painted with improving slogans like, "The French people recognize the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul." Catchy. Father Bernard, hiding in a parishioner's attic, laughed bitterly. They've abolished God and replaced him with a committee's imagination. He scoffed. At least our God had the decency to be mysterious. Theirs comes with explanatory pamphlets. The dechristianization campaign created some unique problems. Marriage, for instance, previously a sacrament, now a civil contract. Divorce, formerly impossible, now easy as revolutionary pie. The marriage rate plummeted. The divorce rate soared. Liberty, it seemed, included liberation from inconvenient spouses. "I divorce thee for lack of revolutionary fervor" became an actual legal argument. Nothing kills romance quite like political differences. That and the guillotine. Death itself got secularized. No more last rites, no more Christian burial, just a civil ceremony and a hole in the ground. Cemeteries became gardens of sleep. Death, now with fewer metaphysical implications. Marie Claire, trying to bury her mother, found herself arguing with a civil registrar. But she wanted a priest, she pleaded. "Priests a superstition, citizen," the registrar stated. "Your mother is now fertilizing the tree of liberty. Be proud." Proud, yes. Nothing filled a daughter's heart with pride like knowing her mother was plant food for political symbolism. The Supreme Being's festival came and went. Robespierre presided in a sky-blue coat, looking like virtue's fashion victim. Within weeks, he'd be dead, and his Supreme Being would join the theological scrap heap. Because in revolutionary France, even gods were temporary. Today's deity was tomorrow's superstition. The only constant was change, and the knowledge that whatever you believe today would probably get you killed tomorrow. Still, at least they'd freed people from the tyranny of organized religion. Now they could be oppressed by disorganized philosophy instead. Progress. Chapter 11. The Festival of the Supreme Being, a modest and universally enjoyed civic holiday. June 8th, 1794. Paris awoke to what Robespierre modestly called the most beautiful day since the universe began. The Festival of the Supreme Being. Because nothing says rational government quite like forcing an entire city to worship your imaginary friend. The preparations had been spectacular. Jacques Tarpot, master carpenter turned set designer for the Divine, had spent weeks constructing what could only be described as Republicanism's theme park. A massive artificial mountain in the Champ de Mars. Because mountains are virtuous, apparently. Flat ground is monarchist. "It's made of wood and plaster," Jacques muttered to his apprentice, "like everything else in this republic." "Shh," the apprentice hissed. "That sounds like criticism of symbolic architecture." At dawn, cannon fire announced the great day. Every citizen was required to attend. Required. because nothing demonstrates sincere religious feeling quite like mandatory participation under threat of suspicion. Citizen Dubois, our wine merchant turned revolutionary, struggled into his best coat, or rather, his only coat that didn't have suspicious aristocratic tailoring. He'd been appointed to carry one of the banners. The French people recognized the existence of the Supreme Being. Catchy. "What exactly is the Supreme Being?" his wife asked, adjusting her tricolor sash. "Whatever Robespierre says it is," Dubois replied, "and today we'd better recognize it enthusiastically." The procession began at the Tuileries. Robespierre, dressed in a sky-blue coat that made him look like a robin's egg with delusions of grandeur, led the way. In his hand, a bouquet of flowers and grain, very pastoral, very unlike the man who'd sent thousands to their deaths. "Behold," he proclaimed, "the author of nature has written his existence across the heavens." Marie Claire, forced to march with her district, whispered to her neighbor, "I thought we'd abolished authors." "Not celestial ones, apparently," came the nervous reply. The whole of Paris had been choreographed. Old men here, young men there, mothers with children in another section, democracy through rigid categorization, everyone clutching their assigned props, oak branches for strength, flowers for beauty, wheat for abundance, rather like an agricultural trade show with death penalties. Henry Beaumont marched with the convention, trying to look suitably impressed. Around him, his colleagues sang the new hymns with the enthusiasm of people who knew the guillotine waited for off-key singers. "Nature's God sees all, knows all, loves all," they chorused. Except, apparently, the enemies of the Republic. The Supreme Being's love had very specific terms and conditions. The procession wound through Paris like a patriotic python. Every house had to be decorated. Tricolor bunting, flowers, improving slogans. One poor woman had hung her washing out to dry and received a visit from the Committee of Public Safety. Undergarments, it seemed, were insufficiently festive. At the ceremony's heart was Robespierre's masterstroke, a statue of atheism depicted as a hideous monster which he would burn to reveal the statue of wisdom hidden inside. Symbolism so heavy-handed it could knock you unconscious. "Citizens," Robespierre cried, torch in hand, "see how atheism crumbles before supreme virtue." He lit the statue. It burned enthusiastically, too enthusiastically. The wisdom statue inside caught fire too, leaving a charred, smoking mess. Several citizens had to suppress giggles. Laughing at divine misfortune was definitely suspect behavior. "A sign," someone shouted quickly. "The Supreme Being tests our faith with symbolic combustion." Nice save. The crowd processed to the artificial mountain, where Robespierre would ascend alone to commune with the Supreme Being. Because nothing says equality quite like making everyone watch while you climb higher than them. "He looks ridiculous," muttered Deputy Fouché to a colleague. "Careful," came the reply. "That's God's best friend you're mocking." Atop his plaster Sinai, Robespierre raised his arms. The crowd below was supposed to feel divine ecstasy. Mostly they felt hot, tired, and worried about looking insufficiently ecstatic. "The Supreme Being has given us victory over tyranny," Robespierre declared. Jean-Luc the baker, somewhere in the crowd, thought about the bread he wasn't baking the customers he wasn't serving, the money he wasn't earning. The Supreme Being, apparently, didn't concern himself with economic productivity. Children had been coached to sing innocent songs about nature and virtue. They performed with the wooden enthusiasm of hostages reading prepared statements. We love the Supreme Being, he is good and kind. They piped, while their parents prayed they wouldn't forget the words. The festival featured edifying tableaux. Agriculture honors the Supreme Being. Industry thanks Providence. The army defends sacred principles, each more tedious than the last. By the 4th hour, even the true believers were wilting. "Is it over yet?" an old woman whispered. "Shh," her daughter hissed. "Someone might think you're bored by divinity." As the sun set, fireworks spelled out improving messages in the sky. Virtue, justice, death to tyrants. Because nothing says religious celebration quite like pyrotechnic death threats. The Supreme Being had been successfully feted. Robespierre returned to his lodgings, satisfied. He'd given France a god in his own image, severe, judgmental, and obsessed with virtue. Within 6 weeks, Robespierre would be dead, and his Supreme Being would join him in oblivion. Turns out, even gods couldn't survive Thermidor. But for one blazing June day, Paris had pretended to worship at the altar of Robespierre's imagination. They'd sung, they'd marched, they'd clutched their wheat sheaves and tried not to think treasonous thoughts. The Supreme Being, if he existed, must have found it all terrifically entertaining. Or perhaps he was just embarrassed. Hard to tell with inscrutable deities invented by committee. Chapter 12. A slight shift in temperature, the Thermidorian cool, down. By July 1794, even the revolutionaries were getting tired of the revolution. Specifically, they were tired of wondering whether today's patriotic speech would be tomorrow's death sentence. Robespierre's virtue had become rather like an overzealous house guest, initially welcome, increasingly intolerable, and now actively rifling through your private correspondence. The convention hummed with nervous energy. Deputies who'd cheerfully sent thousands to the guillotine now found themselves checking their own necks. Funny how personal danger sharpens one's appreciation for due process. "He's making lists," Fouché whispered to Barras. "Robespierre has lists." "We're all on lists," Barras replied. "The question is which list and how near the top." Indeed, the incorruptible had become rather like a teacher's pet with execution powers. His little black book contained names of the insufficiently virtuous. And in Robespierre's universe, everyone was insufficiently virtuous, including, ironically, Robespierre. The thing about running a terror is that eventually you run out of enemies and start eating your own, like Saturn devouring his children, only with more paperwork and less mythological dignity. On the 8th of Thermidor, that's July 26th for those still clinging to the monarchist calendar, Robespierre made a speech. 2 hours of vintage Maximilian, virtue, plots, the need for more purging. The deputies listened with the frozen smiles of people at a dinner party where the host has started discussing his collection of human teeth. "I have made too many enemies in the cause of patriotism," Robespierre declared, which was rather like saying the Atlantic was slightly damp. Deputy Leclerc leaned to his neighbor and muttered, "He's right about the enemy's part." The next day, the 9th of Thermidor, the convention reconvened. The atmosphere was thick enough to spread on toast. Everyone knew something was about to happen. The only question was whether Robespierre would arrest them, or they'd arrest Robespierre. "I demand the floor," Tallien shouted. "The convention lives in fear of one man." "Name him," someone yelled. As if there was any doubt. As if they hadn't all been thinking the same thing while checking their windows for mysterious carriages in the night. Robespierre tried to speak. For the first time in his political career, he was shouted down. "Down with the tyrant," they cried. The same men who'd applauded his every word last week now discovered their courage. Amazing what self-preservation can do for one's principles. "You're twisting my words," Robespierre protested, his voice cracking. "The blood of Danton chokes you," someone shouted back. Ah, yes, Danton, Robespierre's old friend, guillotined 3 months earlier for the crime of suggesting maybe they could ease up on the killing. The convention had excellent memories when it suited them. The arrest warrant was drawn up faster than you could say revolutionary justice. Robespierre, Saint-Just, Couthon, and the other leading Robespierrists found themselves on the wrong side of their own system. Poetic justice, if poetry came with armed guards. But Paris wasn't done with drama. The Commune, Robespierre's power base, declared the convention in rebellion. Rebellion against what? Against Robespierre, who was supposedly defending the revolution which had overthrown the government, which, look, revolutionary logic was complex. For a few hours, 2 governments claimed legitimacy. The convention held the law. The Commune held Robespierre. Paris held its breath. Citizen Dubois found himself with the Commune forces at the Hôtel de Ville. "We must save Robespierre," the leaders cried. "He is virtue incarnate." Dubois wondered, not for the first time, whether virtue was really worth all this fuss. His wine business had collapsed. His friends were mostly dead, and now he was supposed to fight for a man who'd probably execute him next week for insufficient enthusiasm. As night fell, the convention's forces surrounded the Hôtel de Ville. The Commune's troops, displaying the loyalty revolutionaries are famous for, began melting away. Turns out dying for Robespierre was less appealing than it sounded. Inside, chaos. Robespierre, attempting to sign an appeal, got as far as row before a pistol shot shattered his jaw. Suicide attempt, assassination, accident. Nobody knew, nobody cared. The incorruptible was bleeding very corruptibly all over the paperwork. Saint-Just, the angel of death, stood frozen. Without Robespierre, he was just a pretty young man with a talent for writing execution orders, not exactly a transferable skill. The convention's troops broke in. They found Robespierre on a table, his face a mask of blood, his famous voice silenced. The irony was thicker than the smoke from the candles. "Take them all," ordered Barras, who'd discovered his courage at exactly the right moment. The next day, the 10th of Thermidor, it was Robespierre's turn for the tumbril ride. No trial needed. Live by the law of suspects, die by the law of suspects. The crowd, who'd cheered him yesterday, now cursed him. Paris crowds were remarkably flexible in their affections. Henry Beaumont watched from his window as the carts rolled past. Robespierre, his jaw bound with dirty bandages, looked more like a wounded animal than the master of France. The others sat in silence. What was there to say? We meant well seemed inadequate. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine waited. Robespierre's executioner was the same man who'd carried out his orders, professional to the end. When they tore the bandages from Robespierre's face, he screamed, the only sound he'd made since his arrest. Then silence. The blade fell. The incorruptible was now the incomplete. With him died the Republic of Virtue, and nobody seemed particularly sorry to see it go. "It's over," people whispered. "The terror is finished." Well, not quite. There'd be more killing, but with less enthusiasm. The revolutionary energy was spent. France was tired of virtue, tired of terror, tired of being tired. They wanted something else. Peace, perhaps. Prosperity. The ability to speak without checking over their shoulders. What they'd get was the Directory. But that's another chapter in this tale of universal harmony and agreement. Chapter 13. The Directory. 5 leaders agreeing harmoniously on everything. After the excitement of the terror, France decided what it really needed was government by committee. Not just any committee, mind you, but 5 directors who would surely work together in perfect harmony. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that executive power shared among 5 ambitious politicians always ends well. The Directory, established in 1795, was like ordering vanilla ice cream after a meal of ghost peppers. Boring, certainly, but at least it wouldn't execute you for having the wrong taste in dessert. No more revolutionary tribunals, they declared. No more maximum prices. No more virtue. The last bit was particularly popular. France had tried virtue and found it came with far too much decapitation. The 5 directors were chosen for their most important quality, being alive. After years of revolutionary musical chairs, where the music was the death march, simply surviving to 1795 was qualification enough. There was Barras, who'd helped overthrow Robespierre and now dressed like a peacock who'd raided Louis XIV's wardrobe. Carnot, the organizer of victory, who'd managed armies with the same passion other men reserved for mistresses, and 3 others so memorable their names escape even the most dedicated historians. "We shall restore order," Barras proclaimed, adjusting his 17 rings. "And prosperity," added another, whose own prosperity was already admirably advanced. Marie Claire, still working in what was left of Paris's manufactories, snorted at the proclamations. "Order and prosperity," she muttered. "For them, maybe. My wages buy half what they did last year, and that's when there's anything to buy." Indeed, the Directory's main achievement was making corruption fashionable again. After years of Robespierre's ascetic virtue, officials fell upon graft like starving men at a banquet. Why execute your enemies when you could simply bribe them, much more civilized? The new society had a name: the Incroyables and Merveilles, the Incredibles and Marvelous Ones. Young people who dressed in outrageous fashions, spoke in affected lisps, and pretended that terror had been a minor inconvenience, like rain at a picnic. "My Dieu," they'd drawl, "have you seen the new fashion? We're wearing our hair à la victime, swept up to show our necks. So droll." Yes, they made fashion out of execution styles, because nothing says I survived the terror, quite like mocking the dead. Jean-Luc watched these creatures parade past his bakery in their transparent muslins and impossible shoes. "We stormed the Bastille for this?" he asked his wife. "Apparently," she replied, counting the day's meager takings, "though I don't recall the right to dress like a classical statue being in the Declaration." The Directory faced a slight problem. They were about as popular as a tax collector with plague. Royalists hated them for killing the king. Jacobins hated them for ending the terror. The people hated them for being useless. It's hard to govern when everyone wishes you'd go away. Their solution? Rig elections. When that didn't work, annul them. Democracy, Directory style. You can vote for anyone you like, as long as we approve. "The people have voted incorrectly," Director Rubel announced after one particularly disappointing election. "We must save them from themselves." How thoughtful. The army became the Directory's best friend. Can't win an election? Send in the troops. Royalist uprising? Troops. Jacobin conspiracy? More troops. Soup too salty? Well, probably not troops for that, but give them time. Which brings us to a young general named Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte. A Corsican artillery officer who had the shocking idea that battles should be won quickly and decisively, rather than dragged out for the amusement of military contractors. "Give me men and guns," he told the directors, "and I'll give you victories." They gave him ragged troops and rusty cannons. He gave them Italy, rather a good trade, from the Directory's perspective. Henry Beaumont, now serving in the Council of 500, because France needed that many legislators apparently, watched the young general's rise with unease. "He's popular with the troops," he told a colleague. "Too popular." "So?" his colleague yawned. "The directors control him." Henry wondered. Did they control Napoleon, or did Napoleon simply allow them to think so? The general had a way of looking at people like they were chess pieces, and in chess, pawns were expendable. Meanwhile, the Directory staggered on. 5 men who agreed on nothing except their right to rule and their love of other people's money. They faced coups from the right, coups from the left, and occasionally coups from the confused middle. Stability, they promised after each crisis. "This time we've achieved real stability." Rather like a drunk man claiming he's perfectly steady while ricocheting between lampposts. Citizen Dubois, who'd survived the terror through a combination of luck and strategic invisibility, summed up the Directory perfectly. "Under Robespierre, you died for having opinions," he said. "Under the Directory, you starve for having none. Progress, I suppose." The Directory would last 4 years. 4 years of corruption, incompetence, and gradually handing power to the generals who kept them in office. They'd wanted to be the sensible center between royalism and radicalism. Instead, they became the void that nature and Napoleon abhorred. But in 1795, they were still confident. 5 heads were better than 1, they reasoned, even if those 5 heads spent most of their time plotting against each other. What could possibly go wrong? Understood. My apologies once again for the misunderstanding. I will now edit chapters 14 and 15 based only on the text you provided, applying these rules. Dialogue attribution. Ensure clear, attribution. Pause management. Change any. 2. Though your text uses already, and then remove. Pauses, except where they mark a significant paragraph or idea shift. No expansion, tone change. The text will remain its original length and style. Here are chapters 14 and 15, edited as per your yes confirmation. Chapter 14. A Corsican Steps In. General Bonaparte's helpful offer to stabilize things. By 1799, the Directory had achieved something truly remarkable. They'd made even the bloodiest days of the Terror look competent by comparison. It takes real talent to make people nostalgic for Robespierre, but by God, they'd managed it. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from his Egyptian adventure. Adventure being a generous term for abandoning his army in the desert after comprehensively failing to conquer anything beyond a spectacular collection of sand in his boots. "Citizens," he proclaimed upon his return, "I come bearing victory." The fact that he'd actually been defeated seemed a minor detail. In revolutionary France, confidence mattered more than competence, and Napoleon had enough confidence to float a battleship. The little Corsican, though don't call him that to his face unless you fancy decorating a cannonball, had been watching. While the directors bickered and embezzled, he'd been building something rather unfashionable: competence. His soldiers actually got paid. His battles actually got won. Well, except for the Egyptian ones, but we don't talk about those. Director Sieyès, the great survivor who'd made it through every phase of the revolution by having all the backbone of a well-cooked noodle, had a brilliant idea. What if, he suggested, we use Bonaparte to strengthen the Directory? Rather like using a wolf to guard your sheep. But then, revolutionary politicians weren't known for their zoological wisdom. On the 18th Brumaire, November 9th for those still desperately clinging to comprehensible dates, Napoleon made his move. The plan was simple. Convince the legislators that Paris was in danger from a Jacobin plot. Move them to Saint-Cloud for their safety. Then politely ask them to hand over power with cannons. Jean-Luc the baker watched the troops marching through Paris. Again. "Another coup?" he asked his neighbor wearily. "Apparently," the neighbor replied, "though this general's shorter than the last one." "They always are," Jean-Luc sighed. "It's the anger that makes them march faster." At Saint-Cloud, things went about as smoothly as a hedgehog in a balloon factory. Napoleon, for all his military genius, was about as eloquent as a concussed parrot when speaking to civilians. He stormed into the Council of 500, expecting them to swoon at his magnificence. "Citizens," he began, then seemed to forget what came next. His speech meandered like a drunk tourist in Venice. Something about daggers, liberty, his love of the Republic, more daggers. The legislators were not impressed. "Outlaw," they shouted. "Down with the dictator." Several deputies, showing more spine than sense, actually tried to assault him. Napoleon, the great conqueror of Italy, found himself fleeing from angry lawyers. Not quite the triumphant scene he'd imagined, but Napoleon had something the legislators lacked: his brother Lucien, who happened to be president of the council, and more importantly, an army outside. The Jacobins tried to assassinate the general. Lucien announced to the troops, displaying the family talent for creative truth, "Clear the hall." General Murat, Napoleon's cavalry commander and future brother-in-law, understood the assignment. Throw the lawyers out the windows. He commanded with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting his entire life to say those exact words. The grenadiers charged in. Legislators jumped through windows with an agility that suggested they'd been practicing. Within minutes, the Council of 500 had become the Council of whoever couldn't run fast enough. Henry Beaumont, watching his colleagues leap through windows in their togas, felt the last of his revolutionary idealism die. So much for the sovereignty of the people, he muttered, before sensibly following his colleagues out the nearest exit. By evening, what was left of the government had agreed to Napoleon's modest proposal. The Directory was dissolved. In its place, a consulate of 3 men. Guess who'd be first consul? "I am no Caesar," Napoleon declared, which was rather like saying, "I am no fish," while swimming upstream to spawn. Citizen Dubois heard the news in his wine shop. "So we've gone from 1 king to 5 directors, to 3 consuls, to 1 general," he mused. "At this rate, we'll have negative rulers by next year. The salvation of the Republic, was remarkably bloodless. No guillotines, no massacres, just some bruised legislators and broken windows. After a decade of revolution, France had learned to change governments like changing shirts, frequently and with minimum fuss." Napoleon moved into the Tuileries, the same palace where Louis XVI had been held prisoner. The symbolism was lost on nobody except Napoleon, who was too busy measuring himself for a crown, purely hypothetically, of course. "The revolution is over," he announced. "I am the revolution." Marie-Claire, hearing this proclamation, laughed bitterly. "The revolution is over?" she thought. "Tell that to my empty purse. Tell that to my dead friends. Tell that to the promises of equality gathering dust, like the Constitution." But France was tired. Tired of chaos, tired of committees, tired of being tired. If this little Corsican could bring order, bring victory, bring bread that didn't cost a week's wages, then why not? They'd tried everything else. The really amusing part was that everyone thought they were using Napoleon. Sires thought he'd be the power behind the throne. The army thought they'd found their perfect spokesperson. The bourgeoisie thought they'd hired a guard dog for their property. They'd all discover their mistake soon enough. But in November 1799, Napoleon was just a helpful general, stepping in to restore order, nothing more. Certainly not an emperor in waiting. Where would anyone get that ridiculous idea? Chapter 15. The Lasting Legacy of Revolutionary Accord. Peace, quiet, and just a few minor European wars. And so, dear listeners, we reach the end of our tale of universal French harmony. A decade of perfect agreement, where everyone got along splendidly and disputes were settled with nothing more violent than strongly worded pamphlets. If you believe that, I have a slightly used guillotine to sell you. One careful owner, mostly. What had France achieved in 10 years of revolution? Well, they'd killed their king, which seemed important at the time. They'd declared the rights of man, though applying them proved trickier than writing them. They'd invented new ways to kill people efficiently, because apparently the old ways were insufficiently democratic. The final tally was impressive, in the way a tornado's damage report is impressive. Hundreds of thousands dead, an economy that made a beggar's bowl look like a treasury. A political system that changed more often than a hypochondriac's symptoms, and now a Corsican general who definitely, absolutely, certainly wasn't planning to crown himself emperor. But surely, you might ask, something good came of it all? Well, yes, if you squinted, through smoke, while concussed. The aristocracy's stranglehold was broken, though it had been replaced by the stranglehold of whoever happened to have the most cannons that week. The church's power was curtailed, though murdering priests had perhaps been a touch excessive. The principle of equality before the law was established, even if the law kept changing depending on who was writing it. Jean-Luc, our long-suffering baker, summed it up best. We wanted bread. We got blood. We wanted freedom. We got Napoleon. I'm starting to think we should be more specific with our demands, he told his wife. The Comtesse de Très-Fatigué hadn't made it. She'd lost her head sometime during the Terror, though she'd maintained her dignity to the end. Her last words were reportedly, "This is most inconvenient. I have a soirée tomorrow." Marie Claire survived, because servants always do. They're the ones who clean up after revolutions, mopping the blood, mending the damage, pretending the new boss is any different from the old boss. She'd learned to keep quiet, work hard, and never ever express an opinion about anything more controversial than the weather. Henri Beaumont fled to England, where he taught French to bored aristocrats and tried not to think about what his idealism had wrought. Sometimes, late at night, he'd remember that first meeting of the Estates General, when everything seemed possible. Before possibility turned into probability, and probability turned into the Terror. Citizen Dubois prospered, because men who can adapt always do. He'd been a revolutionary when it paid, a moderate when that was safer, and now a Bonapartist because that's where the wind was blowing. His wine shop bore a sign, "Supplier to the Consulate." Last year it had said, "Supplier to the Directory." The year before, well, best not to remember. And what of France itself? The nation that had set out to remake the world in the image of reason? It got Napoleon, which was rather like ordering a salad and receiving a typhoon. Spectacular, certainly. Not quite what was requested. Within 5 years, he'd be emperor. Within 10, he'd control most of Europe. Within 15, he'd be on Elba, contemplating where it all went wrong. The revolution's child would drag France through 2 decades of war, millions more dead, and an empire that lasted about as long as a soap bubble in a blast furnace. But that's another story. Our tale was of the revolution itself, that glorious decade when France discovered that overthrowing the government was the easy part. Governing afterwards? That's when things got complicated. The revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, would echo through history. Every oppressed people would remember that the Bastille could fall. Every tyrant would remember that even kings could lose their heads. Every idealist would remember that good intentions could pave the road to the guillotine. But perhaps the most important lesson was this. When someone promises to fix everything quickly and easily, check if they're hiding a guillotine behind their back, or an army, or both. France had wanted change, and by God, they'd gotten it. They'd gotten more change than a pickpocket at a nudist colony. They'd changed governments like other nations changed their guards. They'd proved that revolution was possible, even if they'd also proved that knowing what to do afterwards was rather important. The kings were gone. The priests were weakened. The aristocrats were scattered or dead. In their place stood Napoleon, soon to be emperor, proving that in politics, as in physics, nature abhors a vacuum. And Napoleon abhorred it more than most. So ended the French Revolution, not with a whimper, not with a bang, but with a short Corsican in increasingly elaborate uniforms, spreading revolutionary ideals across Europe at cannon point. Because nothing says liberty, equality, fraternity quite like forced conscription and continental war. But surely everyone had learned their lesson. Surely Europe would never again see such upheaval, such bloodshed, such complete inability to just get along. Oh, my sweet summer child. The revolution was just the aperitif. The main course of carnage was yet to come. But that's a bedtime story for another evening. Sleep well, and dream of a world where political differences are settled with words, not weapons. It's a fantasy, of course, but then again, so was the idea that all men are created equal, and look how that turned out.